Hola, bona tarda a tots. Agraïment a la Barcelona Knowledge Hub Acadèmia Europea. And I will try to explain my first words in English because maybe it's better for the different people who are following us. First of all, I am honored to welcome to the 10th Modern Disputatio. Here in Barcelona, I said modern because the first Disputatio in Barcelona took place in 1263, and probably the other people are more aware about that and maybe can explain better what it's that mean, Disputatio. No? But the first Disputatio in Barcelona is 1263, and today it's the modern Disputatio. Today we are going to clash ideas, try to collect intellects so knowledge will but. It's time now to open our mind to depth knowledge that our debates bring. Nowadays, we are constantly bombarded with headlines. Today I have experience that some engineering school here in Barcelona asked me about one question, and I have only 20 seconds to ask this question. And this question is about artificial intelligence. And the question is, artificial intelligence is the apocalypse of this world, evolution, or simply evolution of the society? And for me, it's difficult to try to explain in 20 seconds the one specific matter. I don't have enough information to answer that question. I do my best, I did my best, but this is the society right now we have to face and to tackle. Society wants to answer the question rapidly, and the people try to take decisions sometimes with not enough knowledge and not enough dialogue. But today, the topic in this Disputatio in Barcelona is the origin of human violence. Personally, I can't imagine a better place here in Barcelona, in the city hall, to discuss about human violence than this magnificent room, because you are surrounded by wall painting. You can see different paintings here that represent one of the most violent episodes in the medieval Catalan history, precisely. The expedition of the Catalan Company of Eastern Mediterranean in the 4th century to Byzantium. The Catalan Company was an army of mercenaries formed basically by Almogavars. This is a name, normally I use it here in Catalonia. Known by their violence, which was hired by the Byzantine Emperor Andronikos. Andronikos hired the Almogavars in order to combat the increasing power to Ottomans. Fight, you can see different battles. These battles, it's the Almogavars against Ottomans. But fight, power, murder, treason, vengeance, trickery could summarize this episode in the Catalan history, all representing these walls. But in front of you, I think it's this one, in front of you, you can admire the murder of Roger de Flor. Roger de Flor is one of the most people know it here in Catalonia. Roger de Flor was the commander of the Catalan Company. He was assassinated by Andronikos' son. Andronikos' son, after Roger de Flor with Almogavars win the war with Ottomans, finally killed Roger de Flor. Probably this is one of the, it's the room we can find the most violence in this city hall. But today we don't discuss only the violence. We discuss always the power of the dialogue. Today we are going to debate about violence by having an open dialogue and a respectful disagreement. Dialogue is more than exchange of words. It's a bright connecting opposite minds, a tool for trying to understand each one. In a world bombarded by flash information, the ability to engage a dialogue requires patience, willingness to listen, more listening than to speech, and the capacity to assume that our own perspective maybe is incomplete. Discussion means inclusivity in a diverse society. Dialogue is breaking down your own walls, our protection, and opening your mind to other ideas. Maybe ideas you don't agree, but it's important to confront them. Disagreement is not a weakness, it represents the riches of humanity and its different perspective. Today, we are going to challenge and be challenged all together. And we are going to learn and teach. We are going to listen and be listened. Above all, we are going to debate. Gràcies a l'Acadèmia per tenir l'oportunitat avui de poder discutir tòpics que veiem per la televisió molt sovint i que no ens agraden. i crec que és bo que tinguem la capacitat de dialogar d'aquests tòpics i veure'ls amb una profunditat que sovint la rapidesa d'aquest món no ens permet. Gràcies per poder tenir aquest diàleg avui aquí. Gràcies.
Moltíssimes gràcies, Jordi Valls. Just a few words to introduce the session. So, Academia Europea is one of the leading groups existing of academics in Europe, and it's in fact a place of debate, a place of knowledge, a place of make things happen. And here we have a hub. So you have the information here at this banner, and this hub works to make the diffusion of science at several levels. One is at the level of, we could say, academic, and also the promotion of knowledge. And in this case, we have a very special occasion. This is one of our main events during the year, and in this event we want to simulate, as it has happened already 6 times, so here we have Genoveva Martí, that was the head of the academia some time ago, and what we intend to do is to discuss issues that are really, that do matter nowadays, and the violence, with no doubt, is one of them. So what we have here is this academia thanking mainly, and we have down there, this institution in Barcelona is mainly funded by the Catalan government and the Barcelona City Hall, and we are, our headquarters are with the Fundació Catalana per la Recerca i la Innovació, and thank you very much to the 3 institutions that make our movements possible and our expansion also. So today, Óscar Villarroya will conduce that, but before that, we'll have an introduction to begin to put our minds in the state of listening, to try to understand the origins of violence. We have a musician that is going to play for us. He is Koyate Ansoumane. He's a griot of Guinea-Conakry, and he's going to play the kora. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, tinent d'alcalde, regidors, convidats en aquest esdeveniment. Let me say that it seems a kind of obscene to sit here in this gorgeous setting, while at the same time, at this very moment, there are some of the most horrendous fighting we have witnessed in our lifetime in Ukraine, in Israel, Gaza, and Sudan. But it is exactly because this is happening right now, and because we are helpless to end these wars, that it's necessary to carry out research, to study and disseminate it, and to discuss about it over and over and over again. And thanks to the academia, we can do it now, here. Even if it might seem useless, rest assured it is necessary, as it has been in the past, in the history of human conflicts. Moreover, the advantages that we have over these precedents of centuries ago is that their discussions were carried out by people who didn't know what the DNA was or fMRI. Currently, we possess a vast network of skilled researchers equipped with advanced tools, all eager to work together in tackling these issues surrounding human violence with the aim of reducing its frequency and mortality. In this context, we are fortunate, thanks to the academia, to have with us today two globally recognized experts who can shed light on the complexities of human violence. So let me just introduce first Professor Marta Mirazón Lar, who is Argentinian, graduated in biology from the University of Sao Paulo. She holds a PhD in biological anthropology from the University of Cambridge in the USA. From 95 to 98, she was an assistant professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Sao Paulo. She returned to Cambridge in 1999 and now is a full professor of biological anthropology, a member of the Clare faculty, being promoted now to professorship. In 2012, she discovered the site of Naturuk in Kenya, which contained the first prehistoric bone remains found of a massacre between humans. So I don't think it's nobody better than her to begin talking about the human violence. Thank you very much, Dr. Professor.
Well, thank you. It's a huge pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Jaume, for all the help, and Oscar for the introduction. So what I'm going to tell you about is probably completely different from what Scott is going to tell you about. And it's right that it comes first, because I'm going to tell you about the history of violence in human evolution. And yes, you can see that. So we're trying to explain why humans actually perform acts of violence. And as a paleoanthropologist, I study human evolution. I will think first of evolution, then I will think comparative, and then I will think humans and other animals. So I want to take you through our understanding from both a point of view of phylogeny, so our relationships with other African apes and what they do, and then also our own prehistory. And then at the end, I will get to Naturuk. So I will start telling you a little bit about chimpanzees. And I know it's a strange point to start when we're talking about human violence, but it gives you important insights. So in chimpanzees, and I don't mean gorillas or bonobos, I mean chimpanzees, this is a specific species of African ape, violence is frequent, recurrent, and lethal. So they perform attacks on other groups in order to get their territory. So these are territorial attacks, and their own fitness, so the reproductive success of individual chimpanzees, is associated to gaining that territory and the extra food that they get to that. Sometimes also extra females, but mostly it's extra place for food. They actually plan these attacks, and they have all their attack tactics. They first scour to see how many opponents they might have, and if there are many, they retreat. So they only attack if they have a balance of power. And they also, and there was a work published 10 days ago by a colleague of mine in Cambridge, they followed 2 groups of chimpanzees for over 3 years, and they have the territory. In the center, they make all sorts of noises, males, females. Then they go to the edge in complete silence, only males. And the males are all related. It's father, son, uncle, grandfather, cousin, all the males. And they sit in silence, just watching and see if they can attack. So we have there our closest living relative who performs very clear and overt acts of violence. So with chimpanzees, we humans share a number of things. We share a complex social cognition, the male cooperation to defend resources. We both have conflict avoidance strategies. We do lethal intergroup attacks, lethal intergroup conflict, and we also have conflict resolution. But humans are unique in creating intergroup alliances. That is something we do not see in chimpanzees. So once you hear about chimpanzees like this, you might think, well, it's ancestral, right? It's innate. Our closest living relatives have that much violence, must be innate to humans. However, we're equally related to the bonobos, the other species of African ape close to the chimpanzees, Panpaniscus. And the bonobos do no violence at all. They are unlike us and unlike chimpanzees, and they actually can live in territories that overlap up to 65% with the territory of another group of bonobos, unrelated, and yet they still won't fight. They will find a different way. In their case, they mostly decide to hunt and eat different things, so they do niche exclusion rather than conflict. So the fact is that we know we do intra and intergroup violence. In the case of the gorillas, of course, they are vegetarian. They sort of eat in the middle of the food patch, and it's a food patch that is small and they can control. A male can control it. So a group of gorillas has one adult male who can control the females and the patch. They'll fight other males, but they will never fight another group. So they have intra-group violence, but not intergroup. We've seen chimpanzees have both intra and intergroup, and bonobos little violence at all. So the truth is, we have no idea what the ancestral state was. We cannot say that violence is innate to humans because we do not have the comparative, the phylogenetic information to say so. So I thought that next I'll tell you a little bit about our early hominins, Australopithecus, Paranthropus, and all the first bipeds and what do we know about them? Well, we know a lot about them. We have hundreds of fossils of Australopithecines, Paranthropines, and all these ape-like bipedal hominins. Among those fragments, there's a lot of evidence that they were prey, that carnivores ate them, but little evidence of any interpersonal or intergroup violence. So, and there's more, when we talk about these early hominins, we have forms there, and I know it's a complicated graph, so there's no, I cannot point. So it's a little graph about stable isotopes. So this is stable isotopes is part of the chemistry that makes up your body, that you assimilate through the food you eat and the water that you drink. In this case, these particular ones. So depending where you are in the food chain, you will have a different value of certain, of carbon, for example, or oxygen, and stable isotopes. And what you see in that little graph there is that there is one species, the one at the top, super robust, that they eat grass. 85% of their isotopes are grass and sedges. They must have had a social organization like gorillas. They must have sat in the middle of the food and have behaved like gorillas. So it's not only that we don't see evidence of violence in these early hominins, but probably there's a whole diversity of actual social organization, bonding between males and females that we do not have the information about. So the truth is that we don't know the ancestral state there either. But we can then focus and look, well, what about the genus Homo? What about our own lineage and our own evolutionary history? And there we have a lot, right? So these are all fossils of the genus Homo. They can be Neanderthals, they can be pre-Neanderthals, they can be Homo erectus, and there's a lot. Down to 1.5 million years ago, a leg bone with cut marks, there's cannibalism, there is clear violence, clear lethal injuries, and so on. However, we find them in pieces mostly, and because they're so ancient, we cannot tell for sure, even if there's more than one individual at a site, that they lived at the same time. So our problem with them is that we cannot tell apart what is interpersonal violence, two brothers angry at each other, and what's intergroup violence. We find the injuries, we find the evidence, but we cannot be sure of the interpretation. So that brings us to ourselves. And with ourselves, I just want to put a parenthesis. So we have a history of a longish history in Africa of as a species of about 300,000 years, when we differentiated and populated most of Africa through these 300,000 years, and eventually left Africa 50,000 years ago and colonized the world. But most of our evolutionary history as a species happened in Africa. And we have some information, but not a lot about the beginning. So most people that focus on the question of whether there was violence in the prehistory of humans, they do it by looking at either recent hunter-gatherers, so small-scale societies that lived through foraging until the recent past, or through cemeteries, the skeletal record of cemeteries. So let me tell you a little bit about that. So hunter-gatherers, as you know, there are very few left in the world, but 10,000 years ago, the whole world was of hunter-gatherers, right? So it's only in the last 10,000 years through farming and pastoralism that we have different means of subsistence. And hunter-gatherers have been argued to be actually totally peaceful, a little bit like the noble savage. And there are reasons put forth to say why they should be peaceful, why there should be no war among hunter-gatherers. And that's partly because they're very small groups. So, so you don't get sufficient numbers to attack. And also the composition of the groups is not stable. They change quite fluidly through time. Also, they have social networks focus on individuals rather than on kinships. So recent studies in the Congo, for example, where pygmy hunter-gatherers still live, show that only about half the people are related in any one group. The other half are anybody that joined up. They're egalitarian, and they have very few possessions. So what are you really going to fight for, right? They have no leadership, so they're sort of acephalous as social organizations. They occupy large areas, so it's difficult to defend that territory, and it's better to sort of make a marriage and settle that boundary than engage in war. So there are many issues that suggest that hunter-gatherers, in fact, should not have war. And then the suggestion would be that violence is something of our very recent past. It's true in most, so if you review the ethnographic literature, so things written about hunter-gatherers in the last 200 years, so the ones people encountered, most of the violence is actually interpersonal. So they had enormous rates of homicide, so one person killing another person, but relatively little violence between two groups. However, by the time we were taking notes on hunter-gatherers, there were already very few left. And most of those groups had farmers as neighbors and pastoralists as neighbors, rather than other hunter-gatherers. So if you actually look at the rate of recorded conflict in places where hunter-gatherers had other hunter-gatherers as neighbors, then you see that actually the number of recorded events of violence was huge. And you could have, so for example, the case of the people from Tierra del Fuego, my country, which are the photograph Selknam from Tierra del Fuego, and if anybody trespassed in their territory, they just shot them. It was sufficient to kill. They also did ambushes and raids. They were terrified of any strangers, and they had an unused zone, the border of a territory, with a huge cost in terms of resources, a no-go zone, so to avoid the conflict, just like chimpanzees do. We see the same in Australia, in Tasmania, in places where hunter-gatherers lived next to each other. And then we can think that actually there are many reasons for hunter-gatherers to actually have engaged with war. The main thing is your territory, and the territory is finite. It will always be finite, and it will change through time with climate change. So they were always having to fight for that territory. And although the groups were small, you know, foraging units were probably 25, 30 people, but they had linguistic units, usually up to 500, that form huge coalitions. And those are enough to actually set up a defense or an attack. And also it's unclear how much hunter-gatherers moved. We had this idea that they were nomadic, moving all the time. And some hunter-gatherers moved twice a year, but others moved every 2 weeks. Right? So the question of mobility, it's also not that obvious. Anyway, so there are many reasons why hunter-gatherers would have, in fact, engaged in acts of violence. And I took there a sentence from Sandra Bowles who says, taking all evidence into account, it seems likely that for many groups and for substantial periods in human prehistory, lethal group conflict may have been frequent enough to support the proliferation of quite costly forms of altruism. And I said that we could also get information from the skeletal record, from the lesions and the injuries. And I will start with the ones we know best, and that is the Neolithic, the farmers. So this is a paper that was published this year. It's one of millions of papers on Neolithic farmers. And what that map shows, which I think is an extraordinary map, every red dot is a lethal injury, and every blue dot is a sort of massacre. That's Neolithic Europe. The war must have been, well, like they say, endemic. Violence was endemic amongst the first farmers of Europe. But we sort of knew that, and we now want to take it back in time and say, well, what before? What about the hunter-gatherers before the farmers? And there, oh, I forgot. I want to tell you about this, because they just published this, again, one of many new papers that are doing the ancient genomes of all these Neolithic cemeteries and societies. And in this case, it was huge. They did over 100 genomes from one Neolithic site, who occupied this site for, you know, they think 6 generations. And they can show there were patrilocal and patrilineal. And there were basically 2 male large pedigrees and a few outsiders. So again, we're talking male coalitions, endemic violence. But let's go back in time. And what we have, the most famous case, and possibly the oldest, is actually not Nataruk. It's a site in Sudan called Jebel Sahaba. And Jebel Sahaba, it's probably around 12,000 years old. And there what they found, as you can see, all the people there, they're actually buried quite close to each other. The tombs, they're proper tombs, they're buried. Some of them are lined with stones, some have 2, 3 people inside, and about half the individuals have embedded projectile points. They died through violence. But the problem is that the fact that it is a cemetery, and the fact that somebody died, was shot, and a village went, picked them up, brought them to the cemetery, dug a grave, lined it up, put the bodies inside, and kept them, tells you that nearby there was a village. And these people were not foraging. They're probably the earliest cases of sedentism that we are seeing through Jebel Sahaba. And that's why the enormous similarities with the Neolithic farmers. So let me take you to Nataruk, because Nataruk was a surprise, I think, to all of us. So the site of Nataruk is in northwest Kenya, in a place called Turkana, is west of Lake Turkana. So in the map you can see Kenya and Lake Turkana there in the northwest. And we work in an area to the southwest of the lake. And you can see in the map below, all the black dots is all the finds, all the sites. It's very, very dense. And why do we work there? Because through climate change, the lake has gone up and down. So we're actually 30 kilometers from the lake, but where we work, it was a beach. And you can see in the photograph, I don't know if you are able to see the white lines in the landscape, and what you see enlarged on the side, these are the shells. So we work in paleo beaches of when the lake was there. And they're so rich, so many fossils, so many fossils of all sorts of animals. You have to imagine the last paleo beach was about 10,000 years ago, when Africa is the time of the Green Sahara, when it was super wet, no desert, like today is a desert. Animals of all sorts, fishes of all sorts, and very large fishes. I added a picture of a large Nile perch, and indeed we found over 700 barbed bone harpoons. So the people who were there were actually mainly fishing and hunting. So what did we find at Nataruk? I forgot to put a picture of Nataruk itself. It's just that Nataruk, there's absolutely nothing to see. It's the most boring place ever. It's just a flat piece of desert. That's it. You would have never stopped the car to look at it twice, except that one of the Turkana men who work with us said, you know, there are bones there. I said, where? We're there. Just there. And we went, and there were the floor, there were patches of human bones broken on the surface all over. And I said, well, what are all these broken humans doing here? And then I saw the back of somebody's head sticking from the ground. And then we found the people in that photograph there. So what is different about these people? So we excavated 27. Since then, we've excavated another 3 that have eroded. So we never finished excavating Nataruk. We excavated only the bodies that were partly exposed by erosion. So of all the bodies that we excavated, in the pictures, there are the 12, 13 that were really articulated. And they were, as you can see there, in any position you can imagine. They were just in any. There was no burial position. There was no, we excavated and found no pit, no burial. I think they just died, and where they died, they stayed. That's our interpretation. We found individuals that were cemented in carbonates. They died in water, face down in the water, and we had to sort of get them out of the cement, of the evaporated carbonates. They were found individuals that were surrounded by fish. It was a very strange place. And it also, they were not close by. This is over 200 meters that they were spread on this flat landscape. And all of them had evidence of violence, all of them. And these went from projectiles embedded in the head to very clear, the one on the right, he had 2 blows on the side and the front of the head. There was a pregnant woman who must have been tied up. There was arrowheads to the neck. All of them had violence. And what is interesting is that they're not the single case. So this is a skeleton that was eroding. It's about 1 kilometer away from Nataruk. And it was, again, eroding. It's part of our work there. The chiefs always ask, please, can you take the humans that are eroding from the sediments? And these had a projectile embedded in the spine. Actually, these must have gone through the belly, because it's on the front of a vertebra, right? So then we have to ask, these are pure hunter-gatherers. There's not going to be a single cow in Kenya for another 6,000 years. There's no farming. So why the violence? It's actually the prehistory of what we saw with those hunter-gatherers. Why the violence? And in the case of Nataruk, let's start with that one. In light green is the lake today. But this is the lake 10,000 years ago. And it had 100 meters more water than it does today. So that water actually abutted against the mountains all along the lake. And you could only get to the beach in two places. One of them is where Nataruk was. And I am sure they're fighting for the territory. That they were fighting for access to that beach, which was the only place where you could fish, the only place where you could actually go hunt the animals who went to drink, and so on. So it's a straightforward territorial fight. It doesn't matter that they had no possessions, no pottery, no cows, etc. The territory itself can be sufficient to fight. So I try to think, well, what other reasons could there be for these prehistoric fights? So obviously, access to rich resources through territory, but also women and children. And this is going to sound perhaps strange, but the Turkana people, who until very recently, they raided. They're pastoralists, and they raided. And they raided for herds, for cattle, women and children. So these are the three most valuable things: animal, women, and children. So certainly that. They could have put together the density of material we find. I am sure they could put together large groups. So certainly enough reason, and I think enough evidence for us to say that both ethnographic and archaeological, there's evidence that there was lethal violence. So I just want to end by saying, what do we all humans have that is so unique to us? And we have, in paleoanthropology, we call it modern behavior, which is a bit silly name. But we have complex cognition, obviously, language, symbolism, abstraction. We have complex behaviors, altruism, cooperation, teaching, chimpanzees don't teach. We have complex social structures, kinship and non-kinship networks, shared heritage, and most importantly, shared norms that include punishment and rewards. And we have cumulative culture. And we see these appear in the material expression of these through ornaments, through hunting, through marks of individual marks on material culture. We see this coming in this period of the last 150 to 300,000 years. So it's the very evolution of the human mind. So a little recapitulation. So all African apes, including early hominins, may be violent towards members of their own group, and humans and chimpanzees are the ones that engage with other groups as well. And the ecology of the resources, so how defensible a resource is what will determine whether an ape will form a male coalition and attack. In the genus Homo, we have a lot of evidence of violence, but ambiguity in the interpretation, and I think that we cannot really tell. In the case of ourselves, our own recent evolution, certainly we have innate human behaviors in cooperation, competition, and conflict. And then we mediate that through our mind, our evolutionary psychology, which includes social tolerance. Unique chimpanzees don't have that, social tolerance. It includes the composition of our kin networks, xenophobia, altruism, parochial altruism, usually. And we have extensive mechanisms to maintain peace and re-establish peace, very complex ones in social anthropology. And I would say that at the end, the evolution of our modern behaviors, one of the most important dimensions, this is in-group, out-group identification, all the ornamentation, all the colors, all the ochre that comes in, the hatches in anything that anybody does, the ostrich eggshell. And then it's only a step from this cumulative culture to create ideologies around group membership. And then ideologies themselves need defending. And I think that's what brought us to today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mirazón. We'll leave the questions for the end, so we'll continue with Professor Scott Atman, who is a French-American and Catalan and cultural anthropologist and wine producer, right? I mean, he's Emeritus Director of Anthropology Research at the National Center of Scientific Research in Paris, Research Professor at the University of Michigan, and co-founder of Artists International and the Center for Resolution of Interethnic Conflicts from the University of Oxford. And he has researched terrorism, violence, religion, indigenous environmental management, and the transcultural foundations of biological classifications, doing fieldwork, which is very important for our research, with terrorists, Islamic fundamentalists, and political leaders, and Native American peoples. So thank you very much, Professor Atman.
Well, we would need someone to span the 10,000 years from the birth of ideologies to now to really understand what I'm about to talk about. By the way, where's the laser? Oh.
Because they see the other screen,
Oh, okay.
not the one you see.
Got it. So we work with various Spanish universities, including the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona and UNED, Universidad Nacional de Educación a Distancia in Madrid, and the United States Defense Department and the British Office of Defense. So the question I ask is, how comes it that human beings make their greatest exertions and efforts, for good or ill, including killing and dying, not for their own gain, not for family, not even for their own lives, or even for territory, but for the sake of an idea, a moral conception of who we are and who I am. This is the privilege of absurdity, to which no creature but man is subject, of which Thomas Hobbes wrote in Leviathan. Now, I don't know why it's advancing by itself, but when I was 10 years old, my father was director of weapons systems development for Westinghouse Corporation. It was October 1962, and he was taken away. I learned years later. He was tasked with finding out whether Phantom jets armed with Sparrow missiles could knock out intermediate ICBMs. He's a World War II veteran. He came back home. He was unflappable, but this time he was gray. And I said, "Dad, is there going to be a nuclear war?" President Kennedy had just spoken on television. And he looked at me and said, "About 20%, son." And I thought that was great. You know, I was a kid and I figured 1 in 5 was terrific. But it was true. In fact, I dedicated a book to the Soviet submarine commander Vasily Arkhipov, who, at the time, the Pentagon didn't know, Russian field commanders had control of their nuclear weapons, but they needed the 3 senior commanders to launch a nuclear weapon. 2 of them agreed to launch, and Vasily Arkhipov saved the world, I think. That's how close we came to a nuclear holocaust. And I think much more than climate change, it still is the most pressing issue facing humankind, but it is almost never discussed. Almost never. Never in universities, certainly never in the public. And people have no idea what nuclear weapons can do. Now, I don't have anything much in this debate about cultural significance, but I just did a study where we found that there were 30 times more articles on transgender bathrooms than on nuclear threats. And if you consider the importance of nuclear threats, That's crazy. Now, as I was with the Maya and with suicide bombers, I have done work with both of them, I found that both communities were devoted actors committed to sacred values of their communities conceived as imagined kin, not real kin, of brotherhoods, fatherlands, motherlands. In fact, all political polities that I know of have always conceived of themselves in terms of imagined kin, willing to make commitments to these sort of values. Now, we're a group of playwrights and poets and academics and policymakers and military, former military, who embed ourselves in war zones around the world. This was on the ISIS front line, where we embedded ourselves from 2014 to 2016. This is with the Kurdish unit, and we interviewed people like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the Kurds and the PKK, and this is what we do in general. And we devote ourselves to understanding, why is it that people refuse political compromise? Why do they go to war? Why do they attempt revolution? Why do they resort to terrorism? Why are they committed to virtues that Darwin in The Descent of Man called highly esteemed and even sacred, when incarnated in inspired, devoted actors, provide immense advantage to one group over another in history's spiraling competition for survival and dominance? And we find, at least I find, the Islamic State revolution was a revolution. It seems to have failed. The only difference between a revolution and a terrorist group in human history is whether it wins or not. And if you think of the French Revolution, this is Maximilien Robespierre's address to the convention, July 1793. Virtue without which terror is destructive, terror without which virtue is impotent. Terror is the only justice, prompt, severe, and inflexible. It is an emanation of virtue. In fact, without a very, very deep sense of moral virtue, it's almost inconceivable to want to exterminate millions of people innocent of direct harm to others. For that, for mass killings, you need a deep, deep sense of morality. Now, what is it about sacred values? Very little is taught about this, especially since von Clausewitz and more recently since World War II. Most political and economic theory is in terms of utility theories, maximization of costs and benefits and utility outcomes. But this is not the way human beings ordinarily behave, especially in extreme situations of conflict. Now, much more is known about economic and political decision-making based on utility theories and rational choice theories than morally motivated behavior. But here are some conditions of morally motivated behavior. It's insensitive to quantity. It doesn't matter if I killed 1,000 people or one. For example, if I'm a suicide bomber, I do God's will, that's enough, even if I kill nobody. They're immune to material trade-offs. You will not make a compromise no matter what the material rewards will be. They're insensitive to temporal and spatial discounting. Now, in political and economic theory, things which you hold in your hand or are closer to you in space and time are more important than things in the distant future or past. For sacred things, the opposite may be true. People come from Sulawesi to fight with the Islamic State, when people in Sulawesi were literally cannibals and primitive peoples 3 generations ago. Now they fight for Islam. In far-off places, we saw dead bodies of Chinese on the Iraqi plain. And the ancient notion of Jerusalem now is much more important than the actual place, actually. People are blind to exit strategies. That is, no matter how reasonable or rewarding a strategy is to pull you away, a reward is to pull you away, people will refuse. They have a privileged link to emotions. Sacred values are tied very strongly to anger, to joy, and to revenge. They generate actions completely independent of prospects for success, of risks and rewards, of costs and consequences. And they have distinct brain signatures. Now, here's one of the first studies we did. We did it with thousands of Palestinians, including the leaders of the Hamas, and the Islamic Jihad, and refugees, and general population using census. And we did the same thing with the Israelis, including with Mr. Netanyahu, including with his cabinet, including with the settlers, and including with the population. And we offer 3 scenarios. Okay, you do this in psychological experiments where when you talk to leaders, you can't re-experiment without some kind of effect. For example, if I ask them a question and then I ask another question, the previous question influences them. But dealing with whole populations, you do what's called the between subjects design. You take the census, you divide the population into 3, assuming it's the same person. The first one we asked, would you return to the 1967 borders? No. Either for the settlers or for the Palestinians, no. Would you return if each family was to receive the equivalent of 50,000 euros or $50,000, which was actually on the table for the settlers? And we made a convincing argument for the Palestinians. Violence reached ceiling. The more money that was offered, the more violent people became. Would you accept a solution along the 1967 borders if the Israelis apologized for what happened in 1948 without any guarantee that refugees could return? Violence went way down. To the Israelis, would you accept the 1967 borders if the political parties of the Palestine, including the Hamas, recognized the right of the Jewish people to live here? Violence went way down among even hardcore Israeli settlers. Now, we've tried in negotiations to implement that, but it's always been interrupted by spoilers. Spoilers is our biggest problem in negotiations and in ceasefires, and we haven't figured out how to overcome that problem, even when the majority of people want peace. Now, the right graph shows that with the same offers, support for suicide bombing also goes up if you offer a material advantage, an incentive, and goes way down if you apologize. And suicide bombings are always accompanied by joy. Joy in the brain has similar neurological pathways to revenge. Revenge is a joyful thing. That's why it's so compelling. The more you offer a martyr's family money for a suicide bombing, the less likely they are to agree to a suicide bombing. It's a moral duty. And the more you make it a material incentive, the less likely people are to go for it. Now, we use 2 basic things to decide what maximizes willingness to fight and die. And the 2 measures we used at first were simply fusion. You take a circle, me, another circle, which is the group. It could be a flag like Catalonia, and you see to what extent people will merge with the group. And it's a dichotomous response, that is, all gradations are the same except for the last one when you fuse, because people who are wholly fused, who go wholly into the group, behave in ways very different from all other gradations. And we find that this was for jihadis in Morocco, in Tetuan, in the neighborhood of the guys who blew up the trains in Atocha, and who did bombings in Casablanca. That is, when you have fusion with a group, together with sacred values, that is, these non-negotiable values, these are independent predictors of violence. When the 2 interact, you have maximal willingness to die and to kill. Now, we did this in 35 Spanish prisons. We interviewed jihadis. Well, this is mostly Angel Gomez and his team at UNED. 35 jihadis, members of violent Latino groups like Mara Salvatruchas and Trinitarios, ordinary criminals, Muslim, and ordinary criminals, non-Muslim. And if you look at the blue line across over 56, almost 5 years of internment, there was no decline whatsoever in attachment to the group of the values of the jihadis, but all the others declined precipitously, except for Muslim delinquents who began to fuse with the jihadi groups. But otherwise, only the jihadis who were committed to their group and ideals maintained their commitment over time. And this was true throughout the 35 Spanish prisons that we worked in. Now, lately, we've tried to understand will to fight. Every time America loses a war or gets involved in a quagmire, there's a congressional hearing, and they say, we don't understand the will to fight. La voluntad de luchar. We just don't understand it. It's imponderable. As President Obama said, along with his National Intelligence Director James Clapper in Iraq, we underestimated the Viet Cong. We underestimated ISIS and overestimated the fighting capacity of the Iraqi army, and before that, the Vietnamese army. It boils down to predicting will to fight, which is imponderable. President Biden, we gave Afghan forces every tool they could need. What we couldn't give them was the will to fight. In congressional testimony, General Scott Berrier, U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency Director, said, I question Ukrainians' will to fight. That was a bad assessment. It was very bad. It almost resulted in Ukraine being overrun. The United States was providing almost no aid because they didn't understand the will to fight. Why? Because American military doctrine since World War II has been based on overwhelming material power. The United States lost less than 500,000 people in World War II compared to 22 million Russians, for example, or 8 million Germans. They won the war, their part of the war, because of overwhelming power. At the beginning of the war, the United States was 40th in the world in terms of army, 179,000 soldiers. By the end of the war, they were producing more firepower than the rest of the world combined. And they've relied on that ever since. So while that it was very successful in major war, they've lost almost every regional war by not considering the moral conceptions that people have of what they are fighting for. Now, what we found on the ISIS front line was that people committed to their values were much more willing to fight and die than people who weren't. The Iraqi army, for example, was committed to nothing, and they were the first to fall apart. The Sunni Arab militia, they were very close. I mean, we were in the first battle to retake Mosul. The American advisors gave the Arab militia the run of the place. The first time the ISIS started shooting, they ran back away. And they took, not even the Peshmerga, took the PKK, a terrorist organization, to go in and root out ISIS at the same time. But they couldn't hold the village, they had to withdraw, so ISIS came back. And what we found among the PKK and among ISIS, and among some Peshmerga, but among nobody else, was their willingness to fight and die for their values. And we used a very simple measure. So in evolutionary theory, the notion is when someone is big and strong, you try to get away from them, right? So if you present a questionnaire or figures of creatures, humans, getting bigger and bigger and stronger, the likelihood is that they will flee or try to negotiate. Well, that was true for the Sunni militia, it's true for the Shia militia, it was true for the Iraqi army, it was true for the Syrian army. But we did this on an iPad. You know, you slide this, you just slide it, and the figure gets bigger and bigger and bigger, or smaller and smaller and smaller. Both PKK and ISIS literally threw the iPad across the room and said it has nothing to do with it. It is ruhi ve'ghera. It is spiritual strength with bravery. And that was the predictor. It not only predicted what they said and what they did. We counted casualties. We counted willingness of units to resist. Usually, the way the Israelis won the Six-Day War is when a combat unit devolved to over 33%, the Israelis knew it was going to collapse, and they went on to the next target. But what we found for units of the Confederacy during the Civil War, for the Waffen-SS in World War II, for ISIS and the PKK, they could take over 50% casualties and still survive in battle as whole units fighting. Well, what we do is we go into the field And we do these sorts of studies, okay, whether it's in Palestine, or it's in Indonesia, or it's in Iraq, or in Syria, or somewhere in North Africa, or Latin America. We do a lot of work in Central America. We then go and do mass studies of the civilian populations to see whether they're willing to fight and die. But we can't go on the battlefield with them and count the number of casualties and the number of dead people. So what we do instead is we do neuroimaging. Why? We do neuroimaging because you can't fake it. So if the behavioral study corresponds to the neuroimaging study, then we're pretty confident. And that's how I got in touch with Oscar, because he has a neuroimaging lab here, and we do studies together like this. So we do field interviews over a couple of years. We find out who's in the neighborhood. We talk to the police, who are the likely jihadis, or who are the people who are supporting Al-Qaeda, or who do this or who do that. And then we talk to them for a couple of years, often. And then from that group, we pick, almost at random, a number that we can put on the machine. Now, we can't put 500 people in the machine because it costs a fortune to put them in one of these big machines. But we're pretty confident, because their responses on the behavioral items are the same as the rest of the group, that what we're going to get is on the machines is what we're going to get for everybody. Now, this is an Al-Qaeda guy. He's doing this, instead of on the iPad, he's doing it, figures gets bigger and bigger and bigger in succession, because we didn't have iPads then. And then we do sort of brain scans. This was brain scans of supporters of Lashkar-Taiba and Al-Qaeda affiliate. And what we find is they are distinct neural signatures when people believe their sacred values are being violated. For instance, one of the experiments was called a cyberball experiment. They're playing soccer on an image in a screen. This is under the scanner. And all of a sudden, you stop playing with the guys named Ahmed and Mohammed, right? And then you ask them what they think about it. But they're already in a pretty violent group, or supporters of violence. And what happens is they who already believe that their sacred values are in violation are willing to fight and die and have distinct neural signatures. Even values that aren't sacred start becoming sacralized. Now, we found this in Iran when we were working with the Iranians and the Americans, and believe it or not, the Israelis were involved, and the Saudis on the nuclear accords. They were all involved, by the way. We found that in Iran, where we did every province but 2, 11 to 13% of the population were against the nuclear accords. These were rural, religious Iranians who supported the hardline regime of Ahmadinejad. And they were against it because nuclear power had become a sacred value for them. Well, for the rest of the Iranian population, what does it have to do with anything sacred of Iran? Nothing. But for them, it becomes sacred. And there was nothing to do about it. So we found that political polarization, political marginalization, in the case of Iran, and social marginalization, in the case of the cyberball game, produced similar results. Now we're trying to find out, we have an experiment going for Catalans and Catalan separatists, whether that kind of political isolation, there's Clara, she's running it, Clara Pretas, trying to figure out whether in fact the same kinds of neural signatures are going on as went for the Iranians concerning nuclear energy or nuclear weapons, depending on where you were. And what Clara did in a study with far-right extremists was confirm that when people in social media are concerned with sacred values, it's almost impossible to get them to change their mind if you use evidence and argument and analytical reasoning and decision-making. Those things just don't matter once you're locked into the sacred values. So you need a wholly different negotiation strategy, not business-like negotiations, and not something which people negotiate with, for example, the Catalans and the Spanish. But the Spanish state doesn't seem to understand that much of well, I won't go into that. But once it becomes a moral issue with sacred values in question, the more you try to make it a material argument, the less likely you are to make a breakthrough, and the more likely you are to have an intractable conflict that can go on seemingly forever without a solution. Now, we use all sorts of other measures now, threat measures, a knife. These are measures that we use anywhere in the world. Anybody can understand them. They're very simple, little circles, figures getting bigger and bigger. Our bottom line is they have to be understandable by a 12-year-old in any culture. And the results are robustly the same no matter where you go. We just did a study for the National Academy of Sciences on 4 continents with 12,000 people, a dozen countries. The results are all the same. This is true whether it's ETA separatists, or jihadists, or Ukrainian fighters, or Russians. The Russians are much more like the Iraqi army, by the way, and the Ukrainian fighters are much more like the Peshmerga and the PKK. We did this study in Mosul. Among these guys, just after they were liberated, they were put in internment camps. We were trying to figure out whether they'd fight and die for democracy. You can imagine, I'm laughing. You can imagine what the results were. Even though at that moment in Congress, in the US Congress, some hokey, the United States can't do direct studies. The United States government is not allowed to do direct studies, so they hire it out to these polling agencies. And the polling agencies were showing that everybody in Iraq wanted democracy, right? Well, if you looked at the way they do their surveys, it's ridiculous. They have everybody together who can discuss what's going on, and then they sort of make it known that everybody should like democracy. Well, we found less than 2% of the Iraqis thought democracy was an important value. And among the Sunni Arab population, Iraq itself wasn't an interesting concept. And they were not willing to fight and die for it. Even those who were in Mosul and in Raqqa under ISIS brutality were still willing to fight and die for ISIS values, Sharia and the Caliphate, but not for Iraq and not for democracy. Now, we ran studies in Ukraine before the Russians went in, because we had a good idea when we found out that the Russians were moving hospitals up to the front, to the Ukrainian border. We figured the Russians were going to go in. So we started doing studies in Ukraine. And we did studies after the invasion. And actually, we sent Doug Stone, who was deputy commander of coalition forces in Iraq, to work with us in Ukraine. We also set up field hospitals in Ukraine and in Poland. And we were trying to figure out if the Ukrainians were willing to fight and die. And what we found is they were, much more than the Russians were, and much more than Western Europeans were. Most Western Europeans under 30 years old don't even think democracy is an important value worth fighting and dying for. In fact, it was only after the Ukraine invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the notion of democracy and freedom among youth in Spain and in other countries of Western Europe started having the salience it once did. And we find, again, that fusion, belief in sacred commitment to sacred values, fusion with a leader like Zelensky or Ukraine itself, and spiritual formidability, but not physical formidability. Physical formidability was important for Russian troops. It was not important for Ukrainian troops in the field. Now, of course, it's important, but the question is whether you're willing to fight and die and go beyond the limits. In fact, since World War II, insurgent and revolutionary movements with 10 times less manpower and firepower have usually defeated police and armies. Why? Because they run on this moral conception, this privilege of absurdity that I first mentioned, rather than incentives or disincentives like pay, promotion, and punishment. And now we ask ourselves, what is it that really motivates human beings and why to do these sorts of crazy things? To build pyramids which house nothing but dead bones and spend billions of man-hours of doing these sorts of things? Why do they do mass murder? There's a wonderful one-page article by George Orwell, one of my heroes. It's a review of Mein Kampf from 1939-1940. And Orwell says, most Western thought, at least tacitly, assumes that human beings crave ease, security, avoidance of pain. But Mr. Hitler tells people, struggle, danger, even death are more important, and a whole nation of 70 million people fall at his feet. Why, Orwell asks? Because Mr. Hitler knows that human beings don't only want safety and comfort and short working hours and hygiene and health care and in general common sense. They also want struggle, sacrifice, something to live for that goes beyond their immediate moment. And there's an interesting anecdote. So at the Museum of Metropolitan, I believe it was the Metropolitan, there was a showing of Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. You know, that great propaganda film of the Nuremberg rallies, Nazi Nuremberg rallies. And there was René Clair, the great French director, Louis Buñuel, great Spanish director, and Charlie Chaplin. They were all sitting watching this thing. And Chaplin was laughing hysterically, fell to the ground, decided he's going to make the great dictator. He thought it was just funny. But René Clair was terrified. He was shaking and crying. And Buñuel said, "Why are you doing that?" He says, "Because given the state of our societies today in the West, if our young people see that, we are lost." This is a photograph I took in front of the new Freedom Tower. This is where the Twin Towers were. If you look, it's an advertisement. It says, "Commit to something." Guy's lying on his back with a bunch of dollar bills, which is basically the ideology of Wall Street. And we ask ourselves, this is no longer about territory, by the way. The United States has never been territorially threatened since 1812, not even remotely. Russia is safer on its territory than it has ever been in its history. No one is going to attack the territory of Russia, at least an invasion. And China, no one would conceivably think of attacking the territory of China. Yet each believes the other is willing to destroy them. What are they willing to destroy? Although they may sometimes couch it as territory, it is more an idea. It is a struggle for the thoughts that will rule the world. And so I ask myself, with the defeat of fascism and communism, have our lives defaulted in the West to the quest for safety, comfort, and security? Is that enough to assure the survival of things we believe should be our values, much less triumph over the rest of the world? Is that enough to ensure that the world will move towards democracy, as everybody believed until maybe the year 2010? I think the greatest existential threat we face in the end is not violence per se, although a nuclear war will solve that question rapidly. But the existential question, I think, nor is it climate change. I think the existential question we face for open societies is whether our values still have some vitality, because civilizations rise and fall not on their basis of their material means, but on the basis of the values they hold. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Atran. Thank you very much. It's been great. We have now a round table, and we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to leave I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to leave the audience to ask questions. First of all, I would like to know, to recommend this book, because actually, I mean, this book, which is just, published, is from Professor Tobeña and Jorge Carrasco. Both are here. They just have published that. They are talking actually inside this book of all the things that we have been discussing. There is an interview with Scott Atran. There is also reference to the work of Professor Mirazón. So please be aware, if you want to extend your knowledge about that, buy this book. So, sorry? Tell them the title. The title is La Guerra Infinita. From La Guerra Infinita. It's quite easy. So thanks very much. I don't receive any money from that. So please ask your questions. We have I think, 2 minutes. So who wants to ask anything? Yeah, there is one question there. Please,
Okay. No, I have I'll try to make it very short. A question, a very basic question for Professor Atran. And because you have talked about the combination of fusion with the group plus the belief of being in possession of some sacred values. And I wonder how important the sacred values really are. And I'm thinking about cases of, for instance, youth who belong to gangs, extremely violent gangs. It's not entirely clear to me that they're thinking they're in possession of some sacred values, but it's rather simply the fact that they feel that they belong to a group. And people who belong to a group, people who feel at the same time that don't belong anywhere else, they don't fit anywhere else. And I'm just wondering whether that isn't a major factor, the simple belonging to a group.
Not in the long. Hello? Yeah, well, that's what the prison study was about. Not in the long term. We found that the only ones where the resistance and willingness to fight and die was sustained over time was among people who held those values and believed those values were part of the group itself. While the gangs and all the others, they fell apart. You can have punishment and by force keeping people together, or by fear. But in general, those can't compare in terms of their ability to resist, to make revolutions, or to fight wars with the others. Another thing we found on the Iraqi front line with the fight with ISIS was that, and we found this with the jihadis too, in prisons, that for the most extreme groups, the ones, for the PKK, the ones willing to go to the end, the last full measure of their devotion, as Lincoln once said, the values were even more important than the group. So ISIS guys were willing to abandon even their fellow ISIS guys. PKK were willing, and they were very well bonded. I mean, more strongly bonded than any other groups. They were even willing to give up their groups if they thought their values were being threatened by their peers. And one interesting thing about sacred values is they're not norms. They're not, you can't, through peer pressure, affect these things and tell people, look, everybody around you doesn't believe it, you shouldn't believe it. That just doesn't seem to have much an effect.
Okay, there was a question also, no?
I just wanted to have a very short answer, or question is very short. You said at the beginning that the interest in the nuclear threat has gone down since the 1980s, and that matches exactly with my perception when I grew up in the 70s and 80s. That was the biggest threat. There were movies, there were books, there were studies all around. Now we're totally silent about that. What is your explanation for that?
Because, you know, I asked the director of the CIA once, what are we going to do if there is a nuclear bomb, even a simple bomb, on a park bench right, in New York or Washington. And he said, well, shit's gonna hit the fan. I said, really? I mean, what it is? He said, well, we're gonna have to deal with all potentially culpable people. I said, what does that mean? It says all possible enemies who have nuclear weapons will be our targets. I said, what do you mean? Even if there's no signature? And they said, yes, because we can't afford anything else. And I said, so what are you preparing for? He said, about 90 million casualties within the first few minutes. And I was thinking to myself, well, how can you really bring this to the public and to some kind of sustained discussion? It's either got to be extremely serious, where everybody really worries about these things, or you just forget it and make humor of it. In fact, although it's true that when I was a kid, you know, we had bomb shelters and we had duck and cover and we had all sorts of nuclear fears, the only way you could treat it in film was humorously. Kubrick was the only one who was able to treat it. I mean, there was The Day After, but the only way, and Failsafe, they were the three films. The only way to really treat this thing for the wide public was through humor. Now there's not even humor.
Okay, yeah, and then there.
Okay, so this is a question for Professor Alar, and I'd be very curious to know whether there are any archaeological records that provide some information on the difference between elites and non-elites when it comes to involvement with violence, whether or even in a different species that's not a human species.
So non-human species, no. And with humans, again, from the Neolithic onward, right? So once you have proper villages, cities, towns, etc., then yes, there is a violence related to elites, violence related to foot soldiers, kingship, and so on. And there is a lot of evidence, but you have to be talking very recent to get that.
Okay, let's have the last
We can talk after.
Sorry. The last question.
Hi, thanks. The last question is actually two questions, sorry, but I will be brief. Do we have any idea on mechanisms that talk about the transition on violence from being something with a biological basis as seen on the species around us and as you explained, to something that is based on culture, social and identity values? That would be the first question. And the second one is there any evidence on what can be done to prevent people to arrive to a point where these sacred values are so inside them that polarization and violence is kind of the thing? Thanks so much. It was very inspiring.
Thank you. That's great. I'm still thinking about your first question. So I think that there isn't such a clear-cut distinction between humans and non-humans. Chimpanzees do group recognition. They have cultural norms. They have cultural artifacts that differ from one another. I think there's a big difference between us plus chimps and other animals. And still, having said that, I think that there is a big difference between the violence in the archaeological record that we see, or that she just asked, where you begin to differentiate elites, not elites, and so on, and what Scott is talking about. What shapes that transition? I mean, these intangible things in prehistory. When were the first religions? When was society creating institutions that actually became an objective in themselves rather than a mechanism for organizing your social world? I tend to think that it's relatively recent, and it's related to seriously hierarchical societies with institutions like official religions, and then the strides around them. But Scott will pick up from that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, during the Axial Age, right, a few hundred years before the birth of Christ, universal religions started forming. These were religions that were transcontinental, whether it's Buddhism or Islam or Christianity, or even in a sense Judaism, which was a much more pervasive religion at the time, or Zoroastrianism. These were universal religions, and they were exclusive religions. Those generated mass conquests and mass killings of an enormous nature across the Eurasian continent, where most of the extreme violence, mass violence, occurred. Not in Africa or Latin America, although there was, of course, localized extreme violence. But this was a sort of constant thing, especially with the movement of Eurasian peoples, because there's no barriers across the middle latitudes of Eurasia. There's constant movement, and there was constant struggle. With the French Revolution, these ideas of a monotheistic, salvational, exclusive religion came down to earth and became political ideologies for the first time. And those developed at the same time as the notion of nations began to develop. Nations are very much like religions. They have flags, they have anthems, they have values, they have all sorts of things. And so that kind of violence became secularized and became pervasive, and that's still with us today. The second question you asked was whether along this line people can be deterred from getting involved in sacred. Well, remember, first of all, sacred values can be a good thing, right? I just take Gandhi or the American Revolution, where the revolutionaries, they were the richest people on earth at the time. They didn't do it for economic reasons, and they sacrificed their life, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, even after losing every battle for the first 2 years and risking death, for what they felt was freedom, their version of freedom. And this has been true in the civil rights movement as well. When you make a moral choice that this is good and this is bad, something's good like jihadism or terrorism is bad, that sort of terrorism, then what you can do is, once people are locked into these sacred values, it's extremely difficult. Either you have to pummel them, finish them off, which is what happened with the Nazis, who were thoroughly committed, by the way, or sever the networks they happen to live in. And the way you do that is you go into the communities themselves and you engage with them before they come on to those values. And you engage personally. Narratives, counter-narratives, zero result. In fact, just this one anecdote and I'll finish. We did a study of social media of support for ISIS over the entire length of the time ISIS, from its initial conquest in Syria in 2014 to its final demise 4 years later. And we found there was only one event that turned social media in the Middle East from pro-ISIS to anti-ISIS. And that event was the burning of the Jordanian pilot. Why? Because even Al-Qaeda felt that it violated a sacred value of Islam. And the population turned against ISIS because of that. Now, there was in all the billions of dollars spent in advertising and television, nothing had worked. The only thing that worked was something that came from the population itself and was unplanned, but it worked. So we should look for those sorts of things.
Okay. It's okay. Thank you very much. So, un moment, sisplau. Tenim una última intervenció musical del senyor Ansumami, si us plau, i després hi ha un aperitiu servit a la sala galeria, si és així. O sigui, moltes gràcies. Thank you. Thank you. Pues lo dicho, aleshores tenim un aperitiu servit, no sé com s'hi va, però ja ens indicaran. O sigui que ara passar-ho.